Thanks for tuning in to the Young Justice video broadcast. My name is Zach Rhodes. If you've been keeping track, I've been talking to experts in the field of addiction. Addiction is a pretty counterintuitive and complex topic, and it deserves explaining, especially when we have a drug-related death pandemic, I should say, that is just skyrocketing. And despite what seem like honest and brave efforts, it continues. There's perhaps nobody who is more qualified in the country, maybe the world, to talk about this whole notion of addiction, drug deaths, and what to do about it than my guest today, Dr. Stanton Peele. Stanton, thanks for showing up in front of the camera today.
It's my great pleasure to be here in person with you, Zach.
I want to, well, first of all, I should probably tell people you've written several books, at least 7 books, am I correct?
I've actually written 12 books, but 7 major successes.
I'm sorry that I haven't read the other 5. And the last one was Recover, with an exclamation point. I want to get that out of the way and plug it because it's an important
Recover,
book.
Stop Thinking of Yourself as an Addict, and how to recover is based on changing your self-conception, yes.
And so today we're going to talk about, I'm kind of going to let you go, but maybe before we get started, I was telling you before we're going to have a broad range of audience members. On the podcast we get 30 to 45 range. Here we're going to reach about 18 to maybe 60 plus. So I don't know what that means necessarily in terms of who's going to know what about addiction. Maybe you can sum up a couple of the problems and how you come into the picture.
Well, I'm going to describe my relationship with Ethan Nadelmann, and whom I've known a long time, who is the head of something called the Drug Policy Alliance, which is the major significant drug policy reform movement in the United States. For example, they're responsible for having changed marijuana laws so that essentially marijuana is becoming legal in the United States. I'm best known for my revolutionizing how we think about addiction. I wrote my first book in 1975 called Love and Addiction, which said that addiction is not something that is produced by drugs. Addiction is a relationship human beings have with an involvement such that they become completely enmeshed in it to their own detriment, even as they in some strange way are satisfying their needs. That detachment of the addiction concept from biology and from any specific drug, when I wrote Love and Addiction in 1975, when you said addiction, everybody thought heroin. That was addiction entirely. All developments since then, calling cocaine addictive, marijuana addictive, calling cigarettes and smoking addictive, have resulted from those changes in my conception of addiction and the way the whole field has changed. So I want to talk about how Ethan and I have interacted over the course of our careers, and how I think that's coming to a point now where we're at a crossroads for how we deal with drugs, addiction, and how we conceive of both of those things and what steps we take to address our drug problems.
Let's linger there for just a minute, because now I want to make it clear for people. I know that you will continue. Ethan Nadelmann and you share an idea about addiction, the one you just described. It keeps biology out of it. Of course, biologically, somewhere all the way down, something affects all of us. But this notion that addiction is a chronic and relapsing brain disease makes no sense when you start to imagine which life processes drive someone toward addiction of any kind, be it a drug, a behavior, an involvement, or whatever. And so the DPA is founded not necessarily on this anti-disease march, but it is founded, it allows people to, well, it's a way to decriminalize drugs, right? That was the beginning.
Well, Ethan, Ethan has been kind enough to say that reading my book, The Meaning of Addiction, which I wrote in 1985, along with The Natural Mind by Andrew Weil, changed his whole concept of what drugs and addiction were. And I was sitting in my office. It so happened that at a certain time in the late 1980s, I was working for a policy research firm called Mathematic in Princeton, and I got a phone call, and Ethan Nadelmann was an assistant professor at Princeton University, and he told me how important The Meaning of Addiction was to him and how he'd like to get together with me. And that began our relationship. And why my concept of addiction fits very much into what he wanted to do is drugs are not a special, lethal, deadly addiction-producing thing outside of the realm of human experience. They're one part of the continuum of things that people can get involved in destructive fashion. And that fits with what Ethan was trying to do, which was to take the focus off of drugs, as I'll describe, and to talk about the conditions under which drugs were taken and how people could use them in less or more harmful ways. And so the two concepts that Ethan began with were originally, it might have been called legalization of drugs and harm reduction. Using drugs in a way, harm reduction, that minimizes and deters the negative consequences of drug use by changing how we dealt with them legally. And a line that I've often heard Ethan say is most of the negative consequences from drugs occur because of our legal regulations. For example, if you were a kid and you got arrested for marijuana possession, that could impact your entire life. You might have a criminal record, you couldn't get government funding to go to college. It wasn't because the marijuana was so instantly bad or inevitably destructive or dangerous.
I have a friend who just got on, in Vermont we have medical marijuana, and he just got on it and he said, I needed medical marijuana for my anxiety because I was smoking marijuana all the time and I was so nervous I was going to get arrested.
That's a kind of a paradox. You know, there's some people who are taking drugs to get over the fear of being arrested for taking drugs.
Right.
But the basic concept, you did an interview with me and of course Jeannie Little and Pat Denning, that human beings are human beings and they're using drugs for the most part for some kind of consequence that they're seeking. Why in the world do you arrest them for that? Why is that a criminal behavior? So when Ethan and I met in the late 1980s, I'm about 11, I think, years older than Ethan. I'm 71 now. I think he just had his 60th birthday. We had that kind of a common cause. And Ethan was about to begin to create a group that was working towards separating drug use from the criminal justice system. If there's one underlying theme he was going for, that was it. And my ideas fit into that. But part of what we're going to talk about is how Ethan negotiated the difference between what my input was and my personality, which can be sometimes aggressive, into his overall plan for decriminalization. This is a saga of Ethan and me, a ballad of Ethan and Stanton, and it has four parts really. We've just described the first part, our meeting, where we were both coming from, and how our thoughts reinforced one another. Ethan began what was to become the predecessor of the Drug Policy Alliance in 1994. It was something that happened to be called the Linda Smith Center. And in 1994, the organization that became the Drug Policy Alliance gave me a Lifetime Achievement Award, which was very gratifying. Meanwhile, Ethan's organization was in New York City. He tended to have intellectually oriented workshops and presentations and position papers. And Ethan often said about me, I was the person who most often presented to the Linda Smith Center in these kind of informal settings. And Ethan was kind of feeling his way and building a larger coalition. Perhaps among some people there was a growing sense of a need to change our drug policy laws, but he wasn't a major player yet in the history of the world. And let's just say that that took up through the 1990s.
So it's at least 20 years in the making, this whole progression.
If we go from when Ethan and I met almost 30 years ago, and that's now become, and our relationship, I think, is the foundation of a lot of the changes. Certainly they occurred during the course of our relationship. And he started his own organization, as I said, in the early 90s. In 1998, I debated, while he still wasn't the primary representative yet of the field, the purpose of treatment. I debated a man named Bob Billman, and and my whole view is that treatment is not going to solve addiction. The medical model of addiction, and we talked about the chronic relapsing brain disease, says that it's located addiction in your brain and we can pinpoint it. If we could isolate that part of your brain, we could remove it. that's only one small, narrow part of the idea. Well, we can treat addiction away. My concept, my argument has been addiction grows from the well springs of society. It grows from poverty, it grows from inequity, it grows from people's feelings of powerlessness, both in the minority communities and even in mainstream and majority communities. And so that was the debate that we had in 1998. That was the last time the National Drug Policy Organization, whatever its name was, kind of showed me that kind of love. And during the 90s, Ethan was becoming more prominent. And eventually in 2000, he created the Drug Policy Alliance, which coordinated all the two major organizations that were dealing with drug policy reform. And during this entire decade of the 1990s, Ethan and I were meeting regularly. We'd have dinner, I don't know, every couple of months or 3 months. We'd talk about life together, what we were trying to accomplish. That changed with the turn of the century and when Ethan became the head of the Drug Policy Alliance, which gradually became a national player. It didn't start instantly, but there became a growing sense that drug policy needed to change in the United States of America. And Ethan was the person who became the dominant force in that movement. And there were three major things I think that he moved to make happen. One was to eliminate the inequities in how justice system dealt with people who took drugs. In other words, primarily African Americans were arrested for marijuana use. There was a discrepancy in sentencing for taking crack versus cocaine, where crack was mainly an inner city kind of a drug. That was something that the DPA under Ethan highlighted until it's become almost common knowledge now. The second thing that Ethan advocated for was clean needle programs. And you have to understand, clean needle programs are providing people with clean ways to inject heroin if they were going to inject heroin, which was the major source for the prevention of the spread of HIV, and which was adopted worldwide, except in the United States. So that was a perpetual fight that Ethan had to fight. And he has sometimes revealed a little bit of a resentment for the 12 Steps movement. And he's had quotes that go something like, well, the 12-step movement, AA and related organizations, are going to have to answer at some point for their constant harping on abstinence, 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 their failure to adopt to the reality of people using drugs and the way to make that drug use safe, the most clear-cut example of which are clean needle programs. And that underlaid a kind of deep ambivalence that Ethan had towards me and towards the AA and the brain disease movement, or the addiction as a disease movement. Because I have always been against the concept that addiction is a disease, and that way I was the main counterpoint. You'll be showing my life process program, I believe, the website. That's a non-disease approach to dealing with addiction. My book, Recover, says not thinking of yourself as an addict is a critical step to being able to overcome addiction. Starting out, as a 12-step group says, you must, I am an alcoholic or I am an addict, is in exactly the reverse way that a person is enabled to feel empowered. And of course, the 12 Steps talks about you not having power, that you're powerless.
Well, we do, I mean, we've done work together. I don't know what I'm allowed to talk about that you have coming up, but I mean, we've done some writing, we've talked a lot, and so I know what you mean, and I'm with you. But for people who are starting to think right now, what is he talking about? How can going to AA and doing that first step be the reverse of what you should do? What instead should one do to make themselves feel empowered?
It's critical that people recognize the sources of addiction in their life. It's critical that people come to grips with that, but it's simultaneously critical that people realize that they have the capability of changing. Even if they've had a certain amount of failure in trying to change, eventually continuing to try to change leads to success. One of the best predictors of who succeeds at quitting smoking is how many times they've tried to quit. And failure predicts success, because what it says is the person is coming to grips with the idea of changing. The major epidemiological finding that undercuts the entire brain disease model is the inescapable, the unavoidable, the constant finding that most people overcome addiction on their own. Every piece of research that follows people who are addicted through their lives, that looks at people and says, tell us, have you ever been addicted? I do an exercise whenever I speak. I did at that time when I spoke about treatment in Washington for the DPA. I go, what's the toughest addiction to quit? And this is a group of people, typically who've been addicted to several things at once. They always shout out smoking. And then I go, oh, that's good to know. How many people in this room have ever been addicted to smoking? And a lot of people raise their hand. And I say, how many people quit? And then 2/3 of the audience will raise their hand. This is a group that's sensitive to being addicted. And then I say, of those of you who've quit, how many of you sought treatment, a support group, or used Nicorettes or something like that? And often nobody raises their hand. When I did that in 1998, there were 500 people who raised their hand, and not one person had quit due to treatment. Now you're being forced into treatment for smoking addiction. So I say, well, that's remarkable. A group of people who've been so involved in addiction tells me the hardest addiction to quit, and they quit on their own. So, but where Ethan was coming from was, you can't go against AA and have a successful movement in the United States. They're incredibly powerful. People who all the time tell me, well, I know where you're coming from, I agree with you, I don't work that way myself, will still never criticize AA. Before I ever met Ethan, I was on the Oprah Winfrey Show. So the first time Ethan saw me, after that phone call, he witnessed me on the Oprah Winfrey Show.
You were causing trouble.
I was causing trouble. And after that, for the rest of our lives, if I meet Ethan tomorrow, I'll say, Stanton, when you went on the Oprah Show, did you really have to piss everybody in the audience off? Even though Oprah actually agreed with me, she took a time out and said, I don't really know how helpful it would be for me to try and deal with my weight issue if somebody said, well, you were a born overeater and you'll never ever get under control. So
Yeah, I remember her talking about when she got to that question that people have to ask. You're forced into this dissonance where you have to ask, well, wait, if it's a disease, is it like diabetes? Is it pathological? Is it some sort of virus?
Is it inescapable?
Right. And so then the answer is no, but it
and
just
in the
depends
case
how you
of
want to answer
eating, in the case of overeating, you have to come to grips with that because there is no abstinence.
Right.
And so what's percolating in Ethan's mind, I believe, is, well, Stanton knows a lot about addiction. Ethan told me he read Love and Addiction very much in relation to his own life. The meaning of addiction changed his view of addiction, but he's sitting there thinking, well, politically, how can I run with this? He's a political animal. He's a successful political person. And that's how he read the winds. So we proceed into the 2000s. His movement's becoming more and more popular. He's succeeded in two critical areas. Alerting people, and even Republicans know about the disparity in sentencing, that African Americans are disadvantaged. The need for clean needles, which was a slow-baked process in America. And Ethan will say hundreds of thousands of people died in America because we refused to recognize the need and the value of needle exchange. And let me just point out, all of the research by the Centers for Disease Control and elsewhere show that giving people clean needles makes it more likely that they're going to quit the drug entirely, because you're in touch with a provider, you are learning about options for how you might treat it, and most important of all, you're taking care of yourself. Mm-hmm. And once you start taking care of yourself and seeing that you can do that, you're more likely to quit. Now we enter this last decade, and remarkably, it wasn't clear that this was going to happen. Marijuana started becoming legalized, which was something that Ethan had always pushed, and popular opinion followed suit. he was really just expressing the majority viewpoint in the United States of America. And as we now know, with California, approximately a third of the country is under legalized marijuana laws. And of course, prior to that, half of the states or so had been busy legalizing medical marijuana. So one critical element in his policy to decriminalize drugs had set in, and that really was the pièce de resistance for Ethan. It really made him a monumental success. It really showed the power of his ability and the ability of people to change their attitudes towards drugs. Something that people used to say, well, it's a gateway drug. People used to view marijuana just this side of heroin. They reviled, they certainly imprisoned people for smoking marijuana. All of a sudden, that ball of wax changed. Footnote, we now have an attorney general who wants to roll that back. So we're going to the point where, let me jump a bit to the end of the story. Ethan Nadelmann quit as the head of the DPA in May of this year.
With what you'll argue are some heavy consequences, perhaps.
Some critical consequences. He quit, we might ask why. Just before he quit, in the 2000s, Ethan and I spent less time together. We weren't as intimate. But just before he quit, I've been living in Brooklyn for about 6.5 years. We had a couple of dinners together since I lived there. I don't know, once every year or half year. He dialed me up and said, well, let's get together. And we had a very long evening sharing where we had been and where we're going, except Ethan didn't share one major thing with me. He was announcing in February that he was going to step down from the DPA, which he did in May. And you might think that maybe he was exhausted in the idea of having a retrograde administration with Jeff Sessions rolling back all of the laws that he did might have influenced him. But it turned out that Ethan had one major thrust that he was going to put into play before he left. And that was the DPA issued a report and a new movement. Why don't we decriminalize drugs? Now, this is important. Decriminalize means, as opposed to legalization, removing all criminal penalties for people who use or possess for personal use any drug at all. And the drugs that most people point out are heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines. They say, you're going to do that? And the answer is yes. In Portugal, they've done that. Drug use hasn't increased. People are more likely to seek out treatment. And as a part of that movement, Ethan had to go in my direction, because this is what he had to say. The data show, which is something I've always emphasized, most people who use any form of drug do not become addicted to it. Right now, we're in the middle of a craze against painkillers. 97.5 million Americans use a painkiller in the last year we have measurements for, 2015. 2 million people developed a substance use disorder with that, and that's not even necessarily addiction. So we're down to 1% of all the people have used something, at the same time that we're running crazy talking about how people are addicted to it. Now, of course, most people get those drugs from a doctor, and when you're supervised medically, you're less likely to use something in a negative and harmful way, which is one point behind drug decriminalization. Means that people could get heroin and meth and cocaine in a legal setting. It could be provided by somebody, or they could at least inject it in a safe medical setting, which has been shown always to reduce the likelihood of death from drug mixing and impurities. That was the last thrust that Ethan did before he left the DPA. I got a strange email a couple of weeks ago only from a man named Johan Hari, who wrote a best-selling book which pointed out that the drug wars were insane and related that to the idea of drug use being a disease. Mm-hmm. And he said, Stanton, somebody is presenting a case to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. I wonder if you'd be willing to help out with it. And then I received a letter, an email, from a woman who was a lead attorney on a case going before the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. And I said, sure, I'll look at your brief and your expert affidavit. And the entire brief is establishing the idea that addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease, which is the evolution of the disease theory in America. You know, I was stunned that Johan thought that this would be something for me. I was stunned that this woman who knew about my work thought that she could line me up. Let me tell you the difference where I'm going here, the critical, crucial, logical difference in what's going on. Their argument is they're trying to work against people being put back in jail when they're on probation or parole because they test positive for a drug. And then the medical argument is, well, they can't help themselves, therefore they shouldn't be penalized for it, which is a somewhat humane point of view. It happens to be wrong. I mean, people quit things.
It's humane. It's coming from an altruistic standpoint.
And it's coming from a complete, the woman who wrote the affidavit was a physician at Harvard Medical School in support of that brief, who belongs to the American Board of Addiction Medicine, which says you can't escape addiction. Remember back when I asked people to raise their hand about smoking? Smoking is the hardest addiction to quit. People more quickly quit cocaine and marijuana, even alcohol and heroin before they quit smoking. So everybody sort of knows this, and they're selling the idea that you can't quit it. And that's going to be the reason for it. Let's go back to decriminalization, where Ethan is saying, and the DPA is saying, it's not Ethan any longer, we can't, the DPA and Ethan have always been against drug courts which criminalize a behavior and then force people, they coerce people into treatment on the grounds that you can't, they'll put you in jail otherwise. Ethan and DPA have always opposed that 100%. Their logic instead is you shouldn't be put in jail if all that you're doing is using a drug for your own personal use. If you commit a crime, other than that, stealing, hurting somebody, well, those are crimes. You can be put in jail.
So the things associated with addiction that are the ills of addiction that are actually crimes is what they want to see people being, you know, contingencies for or consequences for, not the drug use itself.
And there's two aspects to that, two bowls of, I mean, this is a simplification. Some people are, as Ethan, and I'm sorry, as the DPA pointed out in their decriminalization report, the majority of people are using any drug out of some conscious desire to use that drug for whatever purposes. When people use painkillers illegally, the vast majority say they're using it to combat pain. Crazy. People have a purpose in smoking marijuana, taking meth, taking cocaine. Then you might say, well, there's another group, a smaller group, who've encountered some kind of a problem. They could benefit from help, the offer of help, perhaps even something that recognizes that they have an addiction in that extreme case. But that group also shouldn't be threatened, of course, with legal penalties. The chronic brain disease model and this legal case jumps to just that one group, the most severely addicted, and says to them, and makes their case based on the idea that this is a group that really is not going to quit. And the DPA is, Ethan has no knowledge of this. The DPA is doing this post Ethan Nadelmann on the hopes that this is the best way to sanctify the idea that people shouldn't be put in jail for using drugs. It runs completely against the idea of decriminalization, which says people should be able to use drugs if they choose and get help if they choose. The chronic brain disease model says you can't choose to use drugs. Nobody chooses, and if you use drugs, you're led down that garden path. It's the same old notion to eventually becoming addicted. There's no option there. And that is now facing the process of being embedded in the law. A Supreme Court of the state of Massachusetts is going to declare that to be legally sacrosanct, and everybody else can plug into that. So at the cost of trying to negotiate, in the absence of Ethan, there's currently a temporary director of the DPA, that not having people in prison for their drug use, they're selling their soul to a movement and a way of thinking about drug use and addiction that is going to undercut their larger purpose. Conceivably, we don't know which way this is going to go. Conceivably, that'll become the basis for a whole new draconian way of looking at addiction, everybody being declared that drug use leads to a medical disease and they should be forced into treatment and the penalty of being imprisoned, which is exactly the argument I made back in that debate I had in 1998. And therefore, these debates that Ethan and I had, where Ethan let them sneak in with this view.
Yeah.
He didn't want to go against AA, even though he personally not only was against the AA, he's not a chronic brain disease guy. When he left, there was a big eddying vacuum, and the chronic brain disease model rushed in to fulfill it. And that may end up, as I am now saying, to be Ethan Nadelmann's chief legacy, because I feel he wasn't clear enough in support of my idea that we must defeat, along with the idea of criminal sanctions for drug use, the idea that addiction is a brain disease.
And we're running short on time, but I want to see if I can wrap it up a little bit and you can help. You were on the Today Show not long ago, however short-lived, and I know all of the things you had to say to the show, but what they did was crucial to this point. What they did was sort of create a dichotomy, which I think is a false one. And on one side, it's this humane, addiction is a disease. On the other side is this inhumane, Jeff Sessions-like, addiction is a moral failure. And anything in between, neither side are going to accept you. Although what you've introduced
Well, they
forever,
don't recognize there's anything in between those two things.
Exactly.
And what is in between? You tell people.
Well, a third more suitable option is what you've been saying since your 1975 book, which is that addiction is just, it's based on life experience. And so when you become wedded to something and you persist in doing it, despite the negative consequences that come with it, that's addiction.
And it's a negative impact on your life, and you should realize that, and you should be helped to do it, and you can change it by changing your life, by growing up, by having children, by becoming more mature, by having other things that offset the drug addiction.
So the disease model kind of perpetuates its own feedback loop where you're stuck. It's maybe more humane, but people let you just be stuck in the cycle of believing it's you.
It's more humane than maybe shooting people, but it's not more humane, because to me, and this is where I'll end up, to me, the greatest crime against humanity, being put in jail, I don't want to do for myself or anybody else, convincing somebody that they're powerless. And ironically, we just had a discussion at breakfast with your lovely wife, who works at one of the great methadone clinics in America, where they don't tell people who are taking methadone that you can never escape it. They let people work towards eliminating methadone. The last thing I'll say is, the woman informed me that the Drug Policy Alliance brief in favor of sanctifying the idea of a chronic brain disease is being written by the man, one of the main progenitors of methadone maintenance, a man named Bob Newman, who ironically in 1994, he won a career award at the same time that I did. And his belief is, and I've heard him say this, is that you can't escape your addiction. Methadone is a lifetime, he wouldn't say sentence, it's a lifetime benefit. He tells anybody, and I've heard him tell people, he's told me this, that if people want to leave methadone behind as a way of becoming addiction-free, he discourages them and says, you've got a lifetime disease. If that were my daughter, I would just tell you to happily continue using methadone. So I want to end by saying about what a great program your wife described to me in Burlington, where they say to people, this is a way to help, it's a harm reduction technique and to help you in a period where you feel that you can use that help, but you ultimately are getting to you can get to the point, and we'll help you get to that point if you want to, of leaving addiction behind entirely. That's the critical aspiration and belief in human potential that we need to have to enact sensible drug policy and treatment.
And it's what Ethan Nadelmann wanted, and what you're saying could spiral downward into something he completely didn't want. We are running to the end of time. Like your friend Bill O'Reilly, I've seen you on the program a couple of times. He's given you the last word, except I won't set you up to make it a failing last word. Tell me, what could be a saving grace, if there is any, for the Drug Policy Alliance to get its act together, do something that's on message?
Well, one question I don't know the answer to. I'm not in, as I've described, I've become on the outs with the Drug Policy Alliance. How was this decision made to go with the chronic brain disease? Because the last conference that they ran that I was at was in 2015. They had a panel, one featured speaker in which was Pat Denning, who I interviewed in your show, and a couple of other brilliant women who argued with a woman from the National Institute on Drug Abuse against all the negatives of the chronic brain disease. Pat Denning said, most people who use drugs don't become addicted. Most people who become addicted overcome it. It deflates investment in human potential and changing society, instead localizing everything in these abrupt medical treatments and then throwing people back out in the street. The audience was, to my view, overwhelmingly, the DPA conference audience, overwhelmingly in favor of the critique and the refusal to accept the chronic brain disease. How did that disconnect? How did that sentiment for the group not appear in this decision to go in support of the chronic brain disease model? Will there be, and the gold and silver lining can be, will the realization that the DPA is doing that create a grassroots revolution which will force people to confront the dysfunction of the chronic brain disease model in a way that Ethan failed to do as the director of the DPA?
Well, I'm glad that you're coming to talk about it. We've done several podcasts. I assume we'll do many more, maybe even a follow-up to this one, an audio version. I'm hoping getting the word out like this is one part of the solution. I thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me and allowing me to speak about it.
Yeah, we'll do it again. Thanks, everybody. This is the Young Justice television broadcast, and you can hear the podcast version at blogtalkradio.com/youngjustice. My guest today was Dr. Stanton Peele, the author of the latest book, Recover. Thank you very much.